and thanks for the harmonious opening. I'm now going to spread a bit of discord because I was a journalist and am now a peace academic. That makes me a hackademic, by the way. And I can tell you that attempts to cross-fertilise the worlds of media and peace are not always harmonious. Now, throughout all that time, I was always a peace activist. And to be a peace activist for most of my sentient life was to resign oneself to being part of a minority. In vain did I oppose the British task force to the Falkland Islands as a spotty teenager. In vain did I oppose Operation Desert Storm in Iraq in 1991, the NATO campaign in Yugoslavia in 1999. I was always part of a minority. Today, the situation is a bit different, and in many ways I find myself part of a majority. That is to say, in Congress, with people like yourselves, with colleagues, with equals, we can have a rational discussion, and we can find that we basically agree that we don't want any more wars. We basically agree that we want to see in the world effective measures to counter climate change and its harmful effects. And opinion poll, one after another, in all sorts of different territories, bears that out. Neither do people generally now accept official versions of events. For example, yesterday we heard about the unanswered questions over exactly what did happen on 9/11. And just in the last couple of days, a global opinion poll taken in 17 countries has been carried out, showing that in fact a lot of people don't accept the official version. Something about it stinks. If it's maybe the precise shape of the hole in the Pentagon, or maybe simply the fact that if 15 out of the 19 identified hijackers were Saudis, how come the focus immediately switched to Afghanistan? As you heard Stein Tunneson say there yesterday, the perception is that the harmful effects of 9/11 were not those brought about on the day, but in the way that event was met. Now, we are now, after the invasion and occupation of Iraq, after the increasingly apparent quagmire in Afghanistan, we are now, in other words, in a crisis of military legitimacy. What's at stake is not convincing ourselves or our coevals of the case for peace, the case for effective measures to counter climate change, to tackle the root causes of conflict. What's at stake is the sheer unresponsiveness of institutional life. So, for example, in Australia, the government has just announced an ongoing 3% increase over and above the rate of inflation in military spending for the lifetime of its term in office. It is organising the next running of something called Operation Talisman Sabre, which is a joint exercise with the American military practicing the invasion of another country alongside the United States. Now, that's a policy which no Australian government, for the foreseeable future, maybe even the distant future, could even hope to successfully sell to the Australian people. And yet, it continues in the same dismal way. So, what's at stake is making institutional life more responsive to public opinion, more responsive to the conclusions countless millions of us have drawn from observing global events of recent times. And that's where it's worth working with the media. Because the media has, and must have, an inbuilt bullshit detector. Okay? The crisis of military legitimacy foregrounds absurdities. For example, in the last few weeks, commenting on events in the Southern Caucasus, we have it from no less an authority than Condoleezza Rice, that, and I quote, "In the 21st century, countries do not invade other countries." I'm sorry? Now, politicians in perhaps allied countries like Norway, dare I say, or like Britain, or like Australia, seem to feel the need to nod sagely at such absurdities and behave as though nothing is amiss. Indeed, sometimes politicians indicate that they know they are mouthing absurdities by doing so a little more loudly. When the Minister was here the other morning, we didn't really get the chance to tackle him on this, but he seemed very keen to shout at us on the need for US leadership on measures to combat climate change. So as we didn't get a chance to do so at the time, let's just have a little critical look at that. It's a country which, as has been said, spends more on its military than the rest of the world put together, and it does so with the avowed aim of furthering American interests. American interests defined, copiously documented in official documentation, absolutely explicitly as including securing control over access to Persian Gulf oil. You do not take the trouble and expend the blood and treasure to secure control over access to Persian Gulf oil, and then sign up voluntarily to legally binding targets for the emission of greenhouse gases. Why should you? You actually want the world to remain addicted to hydrocarbons, and that is why that is a red line in Washington politics. The invasion and occupation of Iraq and the determination to scupper the Kyoto Treaty were two sides of the same coin. Now, will things change after the federal election and in time for the climate summit in Copenhagen next year? My tip, don't hold your breath. So, we're in this crisis of military legitimacy, and the media cannot afford to appear to be more credulous than their readers and audiences. They have to retain some degree of credibility. They cannot behave like politicians, and that is why the media is a promising field in which to work. So, how do we work in the media? Well, one of the means by which we can do so is by talking about peace journalism. I used to practice peace journalism when I was a journalist. I worked for the BBC, I worked for The Independent and for Sky News. So I say to people, journalists can be divided into two groups, those who have worked for Rupert Murdoch and those who will work for Rupert Murdoch, which I belong to the first. And throughout that time I was experimenting with and trying to practice peace journalism. So what is peace journalism? Let's have a look at some key distinctions in the representation of conflict. War journalism, the journalism we get in most places most of the time, tends to represent conflict as a gigantic tug of war, based on that question, who will win? Two parties contesting a single goal, a recipe indeed for escalation. If you can only win or lose, then anything which is not winning can only be losing. It's an incentive to try harder to win. Step up your efforts for victory. Whereas peace journalism, as with this rather entertaining cover of the Daily Mirror from January 2003, tends to seek a little further for the causes of conflict. It tends to ask what is the conflict about and where is the problem to be found. Not necessarily, in this case, in Iraq, but perhaps in our appetite for the continued and uncompromising consumption of cheap oil. Don't we remember those days with some nostalgia? So I shall not exonerate Saddam Hussein from blame. I will mobilise our troops and jets to Kuwait and the Persian Gulf. I will BP prepared for total war. The message is, I'm coming to kick your ass, Saddam. Okay, so it can be done and sometimes is done. So that's one.